I thought loyalty would save me, but that morning proved how wrong I was. I stood outside the break room, holding my phone, when I heard Ethan laugh. He said, "She's useful. That's all. She listens, she waits, she does what I need." Lena giggled and replied, "You're too kind. She really thinks you love her." My chest tightened. I pushed the door open and said, "What am I supposed to think, Ethan?" He turned slowly and said, "You weren't meant to hear that." I asked, "So it's true?" He shrugged and said, "Why are you acting surprised?" I looked at Lena and said, "You knew everything about me." She smiled softly and said, "That's why this was easy." I asked Ethan, "Did any of it matter?" He replied, "Don't make this dramatic." I laughed once and said, "You already erased me." He said, "You're being emotional." I answered, "I trusted you." He replied, "And you got attached." Lena squeezed his arm and said, "Let's go." I stood there while they walked past me. My legs felt weak, but I followed them outside. I said, "Ethan, look at me." He finally looked and said, "What do you want?" I whispered, "The truth." He said, "The truth is you were convenient." That word cut deeper than silence. I nodded and said, "Okay." Lena laughed quietly. I turned away before my tears fell. At home, I stared at my reflection and said, "You let them do this." My voice shook. I said, "You loved him." The mirror showed a girl I barely recognized. I whispered, "I won't disappear again." I sat on the floor and said, "This pain ends here." That night, something inside me broke, and something else woke up. My phone buzzed, and his name flashed again. I answered and said, "Why are you calling?" He sighed and said, "Can we talk later?" I replied, "You already said enough." He said, "You're overreacting." I laughed bitterly and said, "You planned this." He replied, "You're making yourself a victim." I asked, "Was she worth it?" He said, "This isn't about her." I answered, "It always was." He hung up. I threw the phone aside and said, "I gave you everything." Silence answered me. My mother knocked and asked, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm fine," and hated the lie. She said, "You don't sound fine." I replied, "I will be." She said, "Come eat." I answered, "Later." When she left, I whispered, "They chose each other." My heart raced. I said, "I feel stupid." I stood and said, "No more begging." I remembered every time he said, "You're different," and every time Lena said, "I'm on your side." I laughed softly and said, "What a joke." I wiped my face and said, "I won't explain myself again." I imagined facing them and saying, "You don't get me anymore." The thought scared me, but it also felt strong. I said aloud, "This is the end." I lay on my bed and stared at the ceiling. I said, "Tomorrow I change." My voice sounded unfamiliar. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Goodbye, old me." I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing his voice saying, "Convenient." Each time, I answered, "Never again." I sat up and said, "I will survive this." My tears finally fell, and I said, "This is the last time." When the sun rose, I whispered, "You lost me." And for the first time, the words felt real. I didn't know rebirth was coming, but I knew the girl who loved blindly was gone forever, buried quietly inside me now completely. I tried to survive after that day, but survival felt heavier than death. I woke up and said, "Just breathe," yet my chest burned. My phone stayed silent and I whispered, "He's gone." I heard Ethan's voice in my head saying, "You're convenient," and I replied aloud, "Stop." Every memory attacked me. I said, "You promised me," then laughed because promises meant nothing. I sat on the bed and told myself, "Get up," but my body refused. My mother called from the kitchen. "Did you eat?" I answered, "I'm not hungry." She said, "You haven't eaten all day." I replied, "I know." She asked, Did something happen? I said, nothing that matters. She went quiet, and that hurt more. I stared at the wall and said, Lena knew everything. I remembered her saying, trust me, and I whispered, you lied. I grabbed my phone and typed, why, then deleted it. I said, no more begging. My hands shook as I stood. I said, you're stronger than this, but my knees gave out. I hit the floor and said, I'm tired. My head spun, and I heard my mother shout my name. I tried to answer, but my voice disappeared. I thought, so this is it. Darkness wrapped around me, and I said, I loved too much. I expected nothing after that. Instead, I heard an alarm ringing. I opened my eyes and said, why am I here? The ceiling looked familiar. I sat up and said, this room? My heart raced. I looked at my hands and whispered, they're younger. My phone buzzed with a message. I read Ethan's name and said, no, the date on the screen made me gasp. I said, this is before everything. My breath shook as I stood and looked in the mirror. I said, I'm back. My reflection stared at me, unbroken and unaware. I touched my face and said, you don't know yet. My mother knocked and asked, are you awake? I answered, yes, barely breathing. She said, you'll be late. I replied, I'll be ready. When she left, I sat down and said, this is a second chance. My chest hurt, but my mind felt clear. I said, I remember everything. I remembered crying, begging, and shrinking. I shook my head and said, not again. My phone buzzed again. Ethan texted, morning. I stared at the screen and said, you don't own me. I typed nothing. I said, I won't chase you. My hands trembled as I stood, but my voice was firm. I said, I choose myself. I remembered Lena smiling and said, I see you now. Tears fell, but I wiped them away and said, cry later. I took a deep breath and said, this time is different. My heart beat fast, not from fear, but from resolve. I whispered, the girl who loved too much died. I straightened my shoulders and said, I won't beg for love again. The room felt smaller, but my spirit felt wide. I grabbed my bag and said, let's begin. I didn't know how I would change my fate yet. I only knew I would. I stepped forward and whispered, watch me. Being reborn didn't erase my pain. It sharpened it. I walked into the office and said to myself, stay calm. My heart beat fast when I saw Ethan laughing near the window. He smiled the same way he once smiled at me. I turned away and whispered, not anymore. Lena waved and said, you look tired. I replied, I'm fine. She tilted her head and asked, are you upset? I said, why would I be? Her eyes searched my face, and that pleased me. I walked past Ethan and he said, you didn't say hi. I answered, I didn't hear you. He frowned and said, that's new. I shrugged and replied, people change. He laughed and said, since when? I looked at him and said, since I started paying attention. He went quiet. I sat at my desk and said, focus. My hands remembered shaking, but they stayed steady. Someone tapped my desk and said, Ava? I looked up and said, yes? He smiled politely and said, I'm Ryan. We're on the same team. I nodded and replied, nice to meet you. He asked, are you okay? I said, why? He answered, you seem alert. I smiled faintly and said, I am. He pulled a chair and said, mind if I sit? I replied, go ahead. He looked at my notes and said, you're thorough. I answered, I like details. He nodded and said, that's rare. His eyes weren't curious. They were respectful. I said, you don't talk much. He smiled and replied, neither do you. That felt strange. At lunch, Ethan walked over and said, you're quiet today. I said, I'm working. He leaned closer and asked, are you mad? I I replied, "No," he said. "Then why won't you look at me?" I finally looked and said, "Do I need to?" He stepped back. Lena laughed and said, "She's joking." I said, "I'm not." Silence fell. Ryan cleared his throat and said, "We have a meeting." I stood and said, "Let's go." In the room, I spoke only when needed. My voice didn't shake. Afterward, Sophie whispered, "You were different." I asked, "Different how?" She smiled and said, "Confident." I didn't answer. Ethan followed me and said, "Did I do something?" I stopped and said, "You always did." He blinked and said, "What does that mean?" I replied, "Nothing you need to understand." He grabbed my arm and said, "You're acting strange." I pulled away and said, "Don't touch me." His face hardened. He said, "You never said that before." I replied, "I never knew I could." That shut him up. Ryan walked beside me and said, "You handled that well." I said, "I'm learning." He nodded and said, "If you ever need help, ask." I looked at him and said, "Thank you." When I got home, I stood in front of the mirror and said, "This hurts." I changed my clothes and said, "But I won't show it." I remembered begging, crying, shrinking. I shook my head and said, "Not this time." My phone buzzed with Ethan's message. I deleted it and said, "Silence is power." I lay down and whispered, "Rebirth isn't gentle." My eyes burned, but my spine felt straight. I said, "Let them notice." Then I closed my eyes, knowing this was only the beginning for me now. Ethan caught up with me near the elevator and said, "You've been avoiding me." I pressed the button and replied, "I've been busy." He laughed lightly and said, "Since when do you get busy without telling me?" I looked ahead and said, "Since I stopped reporting my life." His smile faded. He asked, "Did I upset you?" I answered, "No." He frowned and said, "Then why do you sound like that?" I said, "Like what?" He hesitated and replied, "Cold." I nodded and said, "That happens." Lena stood a few steps away, pretending to scroll her phone. I felt her eyes on me. Ethan lowered his voice and said, "You don't have to act tough." I finally turned and said, "I'm not acting." The elevator opened. He stepped in with me and said, "We should talk later." I replied, "There's nothing to talk about." He asked, "Are you sure?" I said, "Very." The doors closed, and silence filled the space. He shifted and said, "You used to explain yourself." I looked at the numbers and replied, "I got tired." He said, "Tired of me?" I answered, "Tired of repeating myself." The elevator stopped. I walked out without waiting. Behind me, Lena said softly, "She's changed." I didn't turn back. At my desk, a man approached and said, "Ava Miller?" I stood and said, "Yes." He extended his hand and said, "Daniel Hart." I shook it and said, "Nice to meet you." He looked at my work and said, "You did this analysis?" I replied, "I did." He asked, "Why wasn't this highlighted?" I said, "No one asked." He raised an eyebrow and said, "I'm asking now." I straightened and said, "Then I'd be happy to explain." He smiled and said, "Good. Walk with me." As we walked, he said, "You don't speak unless necessary." I answered, "I speak when it matters." He nodded and said, "That's a skill." He asked, "Who taught you that?" I replied, "Experience." He stopped and said, "You know your worth?" I hesitated and said, "I'm learning." He said, "I'll push you." I replied, "Please do." Later, Ethan appeared near the meeting room and said, "You're meeting with him now?" I said, "Yes." He asked, "Since when?" I answered, "Since today." He scoffed and said, "You don't even like meetings." I replied, "I don't like wasting time." Daniel glanced between us and said, "Is there a problem?" I said, "No." Ethan forced a smile and said, "None at all." Inside the room, Daniel said, "He doesn't like losing attention." I said, "That's not my responsibility." He smiled and said, "Exactly." During the discussion, I spoke clearly. No apologies. No explanations. When someone questioned my idea, I said, "Here's why it works." Daniel nodded and said, "Good." Afterward, Sophie whispered, "You didn't over-explain." I replied, "I didn't need to." Ethan cornered me again and said, "You're different lately." I looked at him and said, "I know." He asked, "Should I be worried?" I answered, "Only if you expect access." His mouth opened, then closed. Lena watched, tense and silent. I picked up my bag and said, "I'm leaving." Ethan said, "You didn't explain anything." I paused and said, "I'm done explaining." I walked away feeling light. Outside, I whispered, "This is freedom." For the first time, I chose silence without fear. My life started moving forward without noise. No announcements. No apologies. Daniel called me into his office and said, "Sit." I sat. He looked at my file and said, "You've been consistent." I replied, "I try." He smiled and said, "Trying isn't what this is." I asked, "Then what is it?" He answered, "Growth." He slid a paper toward me and said, "This is your promotion." I blinked and said, "Already?" He nodded and said, "You earned it." I said, "Thank you." He replied, "Don't thank me. Keep working." I left his office and Sophie grabbed my arm and said, "Your face says good news." I smiled and said, "I got promoted." She gasped and said, "I knew it." I laughed and said, "You always say that." She leaned closer and said, "You look different lately." I asked, "Different how?" She said, "You don't doubt yourself out loud anymore." I thought about that and said, "I stopped arguing with my own mind." She nodded and said, "I like this version of you." My phone buzzed. Ethan's name flashed again. Sophie raised an eyebrow and said, "Still him?" I locked my screen and said, "Always him." She asked, "Why don't you block him?" I replied, "Because silence hurts more." She smiled and said, "You're scary now." I said, "I'm peaceful." At my desk, messages kept coming. Ethan wrote, "Can we talk?" Then, "I miss our talks." Then, "Are you okay?" I didn't reply. I whispered, "You never asked that before." Later, Sophie said, "There's a networking event tonight." I hesitated and said, "I don't like crowds." She said, "You don't like hiding." I sighed and said, "Fine." At the event, lights flashed and voices mixed. Sophie handed me a drink and said, "Relax." I said, "I am." That was when I saw Ethan across the room. He was laughing loudly, then he saw me. His smile fell. He stared. I stood straight. I didn't wave. I didn't look away. He walked toward me slowly and said, "Ava." I replied, "Ethan." He cleared his throat and said, "You look different." I said, "So do you." He laughed nervously and said, "I've been trying to reach you." I answered, "I know." He asked, "Why didn't you respond?" I tilted my head and said, "I didn't have anything to say." His mouth opened, then closed. He said, "You used to answer immediately." I replied, "I used to wait." He frowned and said, "Wait for what?" I said, "For you." He swallowed and said, "Are you mad?" I smiled slightly and said, "No," that confused him more. He asked, "Then what is this?" I looked around and said, "My life." He glanced at Sophie and said, "You seem busy." I replied, "I am." He nodded and said, "We should catch up sometime." I answered, "Maybe." He said, "Maybe?" I said, "If time allows." He stepped back, clearly shaken. Sophie leaned in and whispered, "He can't speak." I whispered back, "Neither can his pride." As we walked away, Sophie said, "You didn't shrink." I replied, "I don't have to." Outside, my phone buzzed again. Ethan wrote, "Seeing you tonight hurt." I read it and said aloud, "Good." Sophie asked, "What did he say?" I replied, "Nothing important." I deleted the message and said, "I'm done being reachable." Sophie smiled and said, "Confidence suits you." I breathed in and said, "It's quiet." She asked, "Is that enough?" I answered, "It's everything." That night, I looked at the city lights and whispered, "I'm not invisible anymore." My heart felt steady. I said, "I'm free." I didn't chase the rumors, but they still reached me. Sophie leaned over my desk and said, "Have you noticed the tension?" I asked, "What tension?" She lowered her voice and said, "Ethan and Lena." I replied, "No." She raised an eyebrow and said, "She checks his phone now." I shrugged and said, "That's not my concern." Sophie nodded and said, "You really let go?" I answered, "I had to." Later that day, Mark stopped me near the coffee machine and said, "Can I talk to you?" I said, "Sure." He hesitated and said, "I shouldn't say this." I replied, "Then don't." He sighed and said, "He talks about you." I looked at my cup and asked, "When?" He said, "When he drinks." I stayed quiet. Mark continued, "He asks why you changed." I smiled slightly and said, "Did he ever ask me?" Mark shook his head and said, "No." I replied, "Then that's his answer." Mark rubbed his neck and said, "Lena hates it." I asked, "Hates what?" He said, "That he still says your name." I nodded and said, "That sounds exhausting." Mark looked surprised and said, "You don't care?" I answered, "I care about my work." He laughed softly and said, "You really moved on." I said, "I moved forward." At lunch, I heard Lena's sharp voice behind me saying, "Why do you keep staring at her?" Ethan replied, "I wasn't." Lena snapped, "You always do." I didn't turn around. Sophie whispered, "This is awkward." I said, "Eat your salad." Later, Ethan stood outside my office and said, "Can we talk?" I looked up and said, "About work?" He hesitated and said, "About us." I replied, "There is no us." He frowned and said, "You didn't used to talk like that." I answered, "I didn't use to respect myself." His jaw tightened. He said, "That's unfair." I replied, "So was lying." He exhaled sharply and said, "Lena's been stressed." I asked, "Why are you telling me?" He said, "Because you'd understand." I leaned back and said, "No, I wouldn't." He stepped closer and said, "Why did you change?" I met his eyes and smiled calmly. I said, "I just remembered who I was." He froze. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He said, "That's it." I nodded and said, "That's everything." He looked lost and said, "You're punishing me." I replied, "I'm living." He shook his head and said, "You don't even look angry." I answered, "Anger kept me tied to you." He whispered, "I don't recognize you." I said, "That makes two of us." He stood there, silent, while I turned back to my screen. "After work," Sophie said. "He looked broken." I replied, "He broke himself." She nodded slowly and said, "Karma works quietly." I smiled and said, "It doesn't need witnesses." That evening, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I answered and said, "Hello." Mark's voice came through and said, "He's drunk." I sighed and said, "Then hang up." Mark said, "He keeps saying he lost you." I replied, "He gave me away." Mark went quiet and said, "You're cold." I answered, "I'm healed." I ended the call and set my phone down. I looked out the window and whispered, "I don't need revenge." The cracks in his world were widening, and I wasn't pushing. I was simply walking forward, steady and untouched. Lena texted me first and wrote, "Can we talk alone?" I stared at the screen and said, "Fine." We met at a quiet cafe. She sat across from me, eyes red, hands shaking. She said, "I didn't plan it like this." I replied, "But you still did it." She started crying and said, I was scared. I asked, of what? She said, of losing him. I nodded and said, so you lost me instead. She whispered, I never meant to hurt you. I answered, you knew it would. She covered her face and said, I was weak. I leaned back and said, that doesn't make it smaller. She looked up and said, I loved him. I replied, so did I. Silence stretched between us. She said, I hate myself for it. I asked, do you hate the choice or the result? She flinched. She said, I don't know. I said, that's your answer. She reached for my hand and said, can you forgive me? I didn't pull away, but I didn't hold her back. I said, I already did. Her eyes widened and she said, then why does this feel final? I answered, because forgiveness isn't permission. She started crying harder and said, I miss us. I said, I miss who I was before you betrayed me. She shook her head and said, I was jealous. I replied, I trusted you. She whispered, I was afraid you were better than me. I said, I never competed with you. She looked down and said, I did. I stood slowly and said, that's why this ends. She grabbed her bag and said, please don't walk away. I looked at her and said, I already did. She said, so this is it? I nodded and said, this is release. She whispered, I lost you. I replied, you let me go. I walked out without looking back. Outside, my chest felt tight, but my steps were steady. My phone buzzed with Ethan's name. I didn't answer. At home, Sophie called and said, are you okay? I said, I face the past. She asked, did it hurt? I replied, yes. She said, did it break you? I answered, no. She sighed and said, I'm proud of you. That night, I sat on my bed and finally cried. I said, you deserved better. To the girl I used to be. I cried for every excuse I made, every time I stayed quiet, every moment I chose others over myself. I whispered, I forgive you. The tears slowed. I wiped my face and said, you're safe now. My phone stayed silent. I lay down and stared at the ceiling. I said, the past can't pull me back. My heart ached, but it didn't beg. I closed my eyes and whispered, I choose peace. For the first time, forgiveness felt like freedom, not sacrifice. Ryan walked beside me after work and said, you look tired. I replied, I'm not. He smiled and said, then you're thinking. I asked, is it that obvious? He said, only to people who pay attention. We stopped at the corner, and he asked, coffee? I nodded and said, 5 minutes. Inside the cafe, he said, you don't talk about your past. I replied, I don't live there anymore. He nodded and said, that makes sense. There was no pressure in his voice. I said, you're easy to be around. He smiled and said, I'm not trying to be anything else. That scared me more than charm ever did. Days passed like that. Quiet conversations. Shared silence. No demands. Sophie whispered one afternoon, he likes you. I asked, how do you know? She said, he waits without asking. I thought about it and said, so do I. Ethan started watching us. He stood too close when Ryan spoke to me. He asked questions that didn't matter. One day he said, you and him seem close. I replied, we work together. He scoffed and said, you never smiled like that with me. I answered, you never made it safe. His jaw tightened. Later, Ryan asked, does he bother you? I said, not anymore. He nodded and said, tell me if that changes. I appreciated that he didn't offer to fix it. At lunch, Ethan sat across from me and said, I messed up. I kept eating and said, you always did. He said, I didn't know what I had. I replied, you knew. You just didn't care. He lowered his voice and said, Seeing you with him hurts. I looked up and said, That's not my responsibility. He whispered, I regret everything. I leaned back and said, Regret isn't repair. His hands shook. He said, I loved you. I answered, You loved how I stayed. His eyes filled and he said, Can we start over? I shook my head and said, I already did. He reached for my hand and I pulled it away. I said, Don't. He swallowed and said, You're so calm. I replied, Because I'm done. He stood abruptly and left. Sophie exhaled and said, That was intense. I said, It was overdue. That evening, Ryan walked me home. He said, You don't owe me anything. I looked at him and said, Why do you keep saying that? He replied, Because you look like someone who is made to owe. I felt my throat tighten. I said, I used to beg. He stopped and said, You don't have to with me. I asked, What if I don't know how to love quietly? He smiled and said, Then we learn slowly. That word stayed with me. Slowly. No rush. No fear. My phone buzzed with Ethan's message. I can't sleep, he wrote. I turned my screen off and said aloud, Neither can your guilt. Ryan laughed softly and said, Everything okay? I nodded and said, Better than okay. At my door, he said, Good night. I said, Good night. He didn't lean in. He didn't ask. He waited. I closed the door and leaned against it, smiling. I whispered, This is what peace feels like. For the first time, love didn't hurt. It didn't demand. It didn't beg. And I didn't look back. Meetings felt different now. I sat at the table and said, Let's begin. Ethan's chair stayed empty. Sophie leaned toward me and whispered, Did you hear? I asked, About what? She said, He's not invited anymore. I nodded and said, That explains the silence. Daniel entered and said, Let's focus. He looked at me and said, Present your plan. I stood and said, Here's the summary. I spoke clearly. No one interrupted. Afterward, Mark caught up with me and said, Things are bad. I asked, For who? He said, For him. I replied, I figured. Mark sighed and said, He missed deadlines. I asked, And? He said, He blamed everyone else. I nodded and said, That sounds familiar. At lunch, whispers followed him. I heard someone say, He lost his edge. Another voice said, He's unstable. I kept eating. Sophie said, You don't look surprised. I answered, I stopped being shocked by consequences. Ethan cornered me later and said, You're enjoying this. I replied, I'm working. He said, They're talking about me. I asked, Do you want me to stop them? He stared and said, You wouldn't. I said, Exactly. He lowered his voice and said, I'm losing everything. I replied, You lost me first. He shook his head and said, You're cold. I answered, I'm focused. He asked, When did you become this person? I said, When I stopped chasing approval. He laughed weakly and said, You think you're better? I replied, I think I'm done competing. He walked away. Daniel later said, You handled that professionally. I replied, I learned from mistakes. He nodded and said, Your role is expanding. I smiled and said, I'm ready. Walking home, Sophie said, The balance shifted. I answered, It did. She asked, Do you miss him? I said, I miss who I was becoming. My phone buzzed with his name. I didn't open it. I said aloud, I'm not chasing anything. Sophie smiled and said, You already arrived. I breathed in and said, I'm becoming someone. That night, I stood by the window and said, This feels unfamiliar. My reflection answered nothing. I whispered, Power is quiet. The city lights blinked back. My phone buzzed again. I turned it face down and said, Not today. Memories tried to speak. I interrupted them and said, I'm busy growing. I thought about every meeting I earned. I said, no shortcuts. I remembered begging once and said, never again. My chest felt steady. I texted Ryan, running late. He replied, take your time. I smiled and said, that's new. I wasn't rushing anymore. I wasn't proving anything. I said, this is mine. At work the next day, Daniel said, lead the room. I replied, I will. Voices listened. Questions came to me. I answered without shrinking. Someone said, good call. I nodded and said, thank you. In the hallway, Sophie whispered, you see it now. I asked, see what? She said, your power. I thought about Ethan's empty chair. I said, I don't need it filled. Sophie smiled and said, that's the shift. I packed my bag and said, let's go. Outside, the air felt lighter. I said, I'm not chasing. I said, I'm becoming someone. I walked forward and didn't look back. That felt like victory. No applause followed. I said, good. My steps stayed steady. I whispered, this is mine to keep. The power shift was complete. I felt it settle inside me. I said, I won't give it away. Silence answered. I smiled. I kept walking. My phone stayed quiet. I liked it that way. I said, I'm becoming. Nothing chased me anymore. I breathed out. I felt whole. I said, this is power. And it was enough. I stood taller. I chose forward. The rest didn't matter. I was becoming someone. I didn't chase, explain, beg, or look back, and that decision finally changed everything for me alone today now that I heard the knock and didn't answer. The door swung open anyway. Ethan stood there, eyes red, hands shaking. He said, Ava, we need to talk. I crossed my arms and said, about what? He swallowed and said, about us. I stepped back and said, there is no us. He laughed bitterly and said, don't do that. I replied, do what? He said, pretend nothing happened. I said, I remember everything. His voice broke. Did you ever love me? I stared at him and said calmly, I did. When you didn't deserve it. He stepped closer and said, and now? I answered, I stopped when I finally did. He blinked, tears spilling over. He whispered, I don't understand. I said, you never did. His hands trembled. He said, I thought we were something. I shook my head and said, you thought. I lived it. He fell into the chair and said, why did you change? I replied, because I remembered who I was. He pressed his face into his hands and muttered, I ruined everything. I said softly, you ruined your chance. He looked up, voice cracking, you really moved on. I smiled faintly and said, I didn't move on. I moved forward. He laughed shakily and said, I can't fix it. I said, it's not meant to be fixed. His shoulders shook. He whispered, I loved you. I still do. I answered, you loved what you wanted me to be. He groaned, burying his face again. I asked, did you ever love me for me? He stayed silent. I said, I didn't think so. He sobbed, finally letting it out. I lost you. I said, you did. He said, please tell me I can get you back. I shook my head and said, no, you had your chance. He whimpered, I was stupid. I was blind. I replied, you were selfish. He said, I'm sorry. I said, apologies don't fix what you broke. He leaned back, head spinning. I asked, do you understand now? He nodded, tears streaming, voice hoarse. Yes, I understand. I said, then stop chasing me. He whispered, I can't. I said, you have to. He buried his face again, sobbing, and whispered, I never thought I'd lose you like this. I said quietly, I stopped being yours the day I remembered my worth. He trembled, voice barely audible. I loved her. I loved her so much. I said, she's gone. He gasped, I'm begging you. I cut him off. Begging won't bring her back. He fell silent, defeated. I watched him crumble, voice broken, pride shattered. I whispered to myself, this is victory. Ethan looked up one last time, red-eyed, trembling. I said firmly, you finally see me. He nodded weakly, unable to speak. I stepped past him and said, and now I'm free. That night, the air felt lighter, heavier only for him. I whispered, I didn't fight. I just moved on. He sat there, broken, while I walked into my life. For the first time, I didn't need to prove anything. I simply existed. I smiled quietly and said, I won. Silence answered. He wept. I left. I parked outside my mother's house and hesitated. The door opened, and she said, Ava? I smiled faintly and said, Hi, Mom. She stepped aside and said, Come in. I walked in slowly, looking around. She asked, How have you been? I sat and said, Better than I expected. She frowned slightly and said, You sound different. I replied, I am different. She poured tea and asked, What changed? I took a sip and said, I stopped waiting for people to see me. She nodded and said, I'm proud of you. I smiled and said, Thanks. Later, I said, I've been seeing Dr. Reed. She asked, How's that going? I replied, He's helping me face things I ignored. She looked concerned and said, The past is heavy. I said, I know, but I'm carrying it differently now. She touched my hand and whispered, I never want to see you hurt like that again. I said, You won't. She asked, Do you forgive him? I thought for a moment and said, I forgave for myself, not him. She nodded slowly. I said, It's peace, not reunion. She smiled faintly and said, That sounds like closure. I replied, It is, but quiet. Later, I walked to the backyard and breathed in the fresh air. I whispered, I've changed. My phone buzzed. A message from Ryan. Coffee tomorrow? I smiled and replied, Sure. He texted back, Looking forward to it. I set my phone down and said aloud, Life moves differently when you stop chasing the past. My mother called from the kitchen. Are you okay out there? I answered, Better than ever. That evening, I told Dr. Reed, I feel lighter. He asked, Why now? I said, Because I stopped carrying everything for everyone else. He nodded and said, That's progress. I said, It feels real. He smiled and said, Healing usually is quiet. I leaned back and said, I like quiet. Later, Sophie called and said, Are you free tonight? I replied, Yes. She said, We'll celebrate, small, but meaningful. I smiled and said, Perfect. I walked into my room and looked at my reflection. I said softly, I'm finally enough. Memories tried to whisper. I interrupted them and said, Not today. I took a deep breath and said, I won't shrink anymore. My chest felt steady. I said aloud, Closure isn't dramatic. It's real. I sat on the bed and stared out the window. The city lights blinked softly. I whispered, I don't need echoes of the past. Dr. Reed's words returned. Healing is a process, not a show. I smiled and said, Then I'll take it slow. I texted Ryan again, See you tomorrow. He replied, Can't wait. I laid down and whispered, I'm safe now. My phone stayed quiet after that. The silence felt full. I thought about Ethan, about Lena, about every tear I once shed. I said, It's over. No one answered, and I didn't expect them to. I closed my eyes and said, I'm enough for me. The moonlight hit my face. I whispered, Closure doesn't have to shout. It just needs to settle. I smiled faintly, knowing I finally let the past stay behind me. I exhaled slowly and said, I'm home in my own life. I stepped into the hall and heard Sophie whisper, Breathe, you've got this. I smiled and said, I know. She squeezed my hand and said, look at you. I laughed softly and replied, I feel calm. Ryan stood beside me and asked, ready? I nodded and said, more than ready. As we walked forward, someone murmured, she's impressive. I pretended not to hear. Ryan leaned closer and said, they're watching. I answered, let them. The lights felt warm, not heavy. A voice behind me said, Ava? I stopped for half a second, then kept walking. Sophie whispered, that's him. I said quietly, I know. My heart stayed steady. Ethan stepped into my view and said, wait. I turned slightly and said, yes? His mouth opened, then closed. He tried again and said, you look different. I replied, people grow. He swallowed and said, can we talk? I looked at him calmly and said, there's nothing left to say. He frowned and said, I never meant to lose you. I answered, intent doesn't erase damage. He said, I made mistakes. I nodded and said, so did I, staying too long. His voice cracked as he said, I still think about you. I replied, that's not my responsibility anymore. He reached out and stopped himself. He whispered, I don't recognize you. I met his eyes and said, that's because you never really saw me. Silence stretched between us. Someone nearby cleared their throat. Ryan said gently, we should go. I looked at Ethan one last time and said, take care. He said my name again, softer. I didn't answer. As I walked away, Sophie whispered, you were untouchable. I smiled and said, I felt free. Ryan asked, are you okay? I said, I'm lighter. We joined the others and someone said, great presentation. I replied, thank you. Another voice added, you handled that well. I nodded and said, I'm proud of myself. Ryan smiled and said, you should be. My phone buzzed. A message from my mother read, I saw the photos. You look happy. I typed back, I am. Sophie raised her glass and said, to new chapters. I lifted mine and said, to choosing myself. Ryan said, to peace. We clinked glasses. Laughter surrounded me, warm and real. Later, as the crowd thinned, Ryan asked, do you regret not hearing him out? I shook my head and said, I heard him for years. He nodded and said, then this is closure. I replied, it's justice. Outside, the night air felt soft. Sophie hugged me and said, you did it. I whispered, I survived. She pulled back and said, no, you thrived. Ryan took my hand and asked, where to next? I smiled and said, forward. Behind us, I sensed a presence, then nothing. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. I said quietly, my life is mine. Ryan squeezed my hand and said, always. I looked ahead and said, I'm done begging, explaining, waiting. He replied, you're free. I nodded and said, completely. The doors closed behind us. The past stayed outside. I walked on, steady and whole, knowing I was reborn, unreachable, and finally free.